I woke that Christmas morning with my heart heavy yet hopeful. For weeks, I had rehearsed how I would greet my son's fiancée's parents, what I would say, how I would sit, how I would smile. I practiced in front of my bathroom mirror until the words felt natural, until my nervous hands stopped shaking. I wasn't bringing any gifts wrapped in shiny paper like the rest of them would. My Social Security check barely covered rent and groceries. But I had polished my old black shoes until they gleamed, pressed my only good white shirt with extra care, and shaved so carefully I nicked my chin twice. The small cuts stung, but I dabbed them clean. Standing in my tiny apartment, I looked at myself one last time. The shirt was 15 years old, the pants had a barely visible stain near the pocket, and my jacket had seen better decades. But I told myself it didn't matter. It's not about appearances, I whispered to my reflection. It's about family, about belonging. Deep in my chest, though, doubt gnawed like hunger. Would my son see me as his father today, or as the burden he wished wasn't there? The drive to his house took 20 minutes through neighborhoods that grew fancier with each turn. By the time I reached his street, the houses had 3-car garages and perfectly manicured lawns. His house sat at the end of the block like a crown jewel, all brick and tall windows. When I reached his porch, warmth spilled out before I even knocked. Laughter bubbled from inside, mixing with the gentle clink of expensive glasses and soft jazz music. The sound of people having the kind of Christmas I'd only seen in movies. My son opened the door, and in that first glance, everything changed. His eyes moved from my face down to my jacket, then my worn trousers, then back up to my face. His smile, so bright just seconds before, faltered like a candle in wind. "Dad." His voice was low, sharp with something I'd never heard before. "You should have told me you were coming in that." The words hit me like cold water. Not, "Merry Christmas," or, "I'm glad you're here." Just disappointment wrapped in embarrassment. The warmth from inside didn't reach me. It stopped cold at the threshold where I stood. I stepped inside anyway, but his darting eyes told me my presence would cost him something precious. The living room took my breath away, but not in a good way. Everything glittered like a magazine spread come to life. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, casting crystal light across velvet drapes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The furniture looked too perfect to sit on, all cream leather and polished wood. His fiancée's family sat arranged around the room like carefully placed museum pieces. The father wore a suit that fit him like it was sewn onto his body. The mother's jewelry caught light every time she moved her hands, which she did often while speaking. Their clothes, their posture, their way of holding wine glasses, everything screamed money and class. I could feel my son's shoulders stiffen whenever I moved, as though my very breath stained the air he was trying to keep pure. When I sat down, the leather cushion made a soft squeaking sound that seemed to echo. I forced a smile, nodded along with conversations about wine regions I'd never heard of, and laughed at jokes I didn't understand. Every second reminded me that I was an outsider looking into my own son's home. But I told myself to hang on. Just survive until dessert. One bite of sweetness, shared together, might make this all worth it. Dinner began with china so delicate I was afraid to touch it. The plates had gold trim that caught the candlelight, and there were more forks beside my plate than I'd use in a week. I watched how the others held their utensils, tried to copy their movements, but every sound I made felt magnified 10 times. The scrape of my fork against the plate, the clink when I set down my water glass. Even my breathing seemed too loud in this room, full of whispered conversations and polite laughter. I spoke sparingly, sharing a simple story about Christmas when my son was young. How we'd made cookies from a box mix, and he'd eaten half the dough raw. The story felt clumsy in this elegant space, and I watched my son's face tighten like I was embarrassing him. His laughter at his fiancée's parents' jokes was louder than usual, desperate, like he was proving something. When they mentioned their country club, their recent trip to France, their son's Harvard degree, my son nodded eagerly, hanging on every word. I began to realize the truth that cut deeper than any knife. I wasn't part of this gathering. I was an obstacle he had to manage, a problem he hoped would disappear quietly. And when dessert drew near, his mask finally slipped completely. As the dinner plates were cleared away, I felt a flutter of hope. We'd made it through the hardest part. Now came dessert, maybe chocolate cake or apple pie. Something sweet we could share, a memory I could take home and treasure. My son leaned close to me, so close I could smell his expensive cologne. His voice was low but not low enough, carrying just far enough for others to hear. Dad, maybe you should go now, before dessert. No one here needs to associate. The word associate hit me like a slap. My fork slipped from my fingers, clattering against my plate with a sound that sliced through the gentle dinner conversation. Every head turned toward the noise, toward me. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. Shame flooded through me, hot and thick, followed immediately by something sharper, disbelief. He wasn't asking me to leave. He wasn't even making an excuse about getting tired or having another engagement. He was discarding me. Right here, in front of these people he was trying so hard to impress. Like I was something embarrassing that needed to be hidden away before the important guests noticed. My hands began to shake, but underneath the humiliation, another feeling sparked to life. Anger. Cold, steady anger that made my vision clear and my voice strong. In that frozen moment, 27 years of memories crashed over me like a wave. Nights when I'd worked double shifts at the factory and come home to find him waiting up, wanting help with homework. Times I'd skip dinner so he could eat seconds, telling him I wasn't hungry when my stomach ached with emptiness. I remembered patching his shoes with duct tape so he wouldn't go to school with holes in his soles. Staying up all night when he had fever, walking him to school every day for 3 years because we couldn't afford a car. Teaching him to ride a bike in the alley behind our apartment building, running alongside him until my lungs burned. Every sacrifice I'd made, every dollar I'd saved, every moment I'd put his needs before my own, all of it was being erased with a single sentence. He wanted me gone before these rich people had to acknowledge that someone like me existed in his life. My humiliation burned hot in my chest, but underneath it, another fire sparked to life. If he wanted me to stay silent, to disappear quietly like a good little embarrassment, he was about to learn how wrong he was. I opened my mouth, and the entire room went perfectly, completely still. My voice rose from somewhere deep in my chest, steady despite the way my hands trembled in my lap. The words came out clear and sharp, cutting through the polite dinner conversation like a sword through silk. Do you know why your fiancé left you? The question hung in the air like smoke. My son's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing without sound. A ripple of shock spread around the table. Forks stopped moving. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in the room fixed on me with the intensity of spotlights. His fiancée's mother set down her glass with a tiny clink that sounded like thunder in the sudden silence. The father's eyebrows rose slowly, his attention shifting from me to my son and back again. I could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads. My son tried to recover, his voice coming out strangled. Dad, don't start dash. But I wasn't the same man who'd walked through his door an hour ago, hoping to belong. That man had been killed by his shame, by his need to hide me like a dirty secret. This man had nothing left to lose. And I had so much more to reveal. The truth he'd buried was about to be unearthed, and everyone at this perfect table was going to hear it. For months, he'd been telling everyone the same lie. His beautiful fiancée had left him because she was a gold digger. She'd seen his success, his nice house, his promising career, and decided she wanted more. A richer man, a bigger house, a more luxurious lifestyle. That lie had protected his pride, made him the victim instead of the problem. Poor heartbroken man, betrayed by a greedy woman who couldn't appreciate what she had. I looked directly at him as I spoke, watching his face crumble with every word. She didn't leave because she was greedy. She left because of this. I pointed straight at him, my finger trembling but steady. Your pride. Your shame of where you come from. Gasps filled the room like air being sucked out. Forks froze in midair. Wine glasses stopped moving toward lips. His fiancée's mother pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes wide with shock. The father's expression shifted from polite confusion to something harder, more judging. My son's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists on the white tablecloth. I could see fear flickering behind his anger now, the terror of having his carefully constructed image stripped away in front of the very people he was trying to impress. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. The truth I was about to tell wasn't mine. It belonged to the woman who'd loved my son enough to try changing him, who'd finally given up when she realized he'd rather lose her than face himself. She told me herself. I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. She said, "Your son hides me, just like he hides you. He's ashamed of anything real." The silence that followed was deafening. His fiancée's mother set down her wine glass, so hard I thought it might shatter. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. The father shifted in his chair, his eyes moving from me to my son with an expression I couldn't quite read: disappointment, maybe, or disgust. I watched my son's face cycle through emotions like a broken television changing channels. Shock, anger, fear, embarrassment, all flashing across his features faster than he could control them. His fiancée's mother finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like glass. "Is this true?" My son opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time in years, he had no smooth answer, no charming deflection. His carefully constructed image was cracking like thin ice, and everyone could hear it breaking. And I still wasn't finished speaking. I watched my son struggle for words that wouldn't come. His hands clenched into fists on the crisp white tablecloth, knuckles going white with pressure. When he finally spoke, his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Dad, enough." But the tremor in those two words betrayed him completely. This wasn't the confident man who'd opened the door an hour ago. This wasn't the smooth-talking charmer who'd won over his fiancée's family with stories about his success and bright future. This was the boy I'd raised, finally visible beneath all the polish and pretense. The scared child who used to hide behind my legs when strangers talked to him, who cried when other kids made fun of his secondhand clothes. His friends with their perfect manners and expensive educations now saw him for what he really was. A man so desperate to escape his background that he'd bury his own father to do it. The mask of confidence he'd worn so carefully was slipping, revealing someone lost and ashamed and afraid. I could have stopped there. I could have let him keep some small piece of dignity. But he'd made his choice when he tried to throw me away like garbage. The wound had to be opened completely before it could heal. And I was the only one with sharp enough words to cut that deep. My voice filled the dining room like a judge reading a verdict. "You told everyone she was greedy. But the truth is she was tired. Tired of your arrogance, your obsession with image, your need to bury the truth of who you are." The words hit him like physical blows. I watched him flinch with each accusation, his face growing paler by the second. Around the table, his guests sat frozen in shock, their holiday dinner transformed into something none of them had expected to witness. His fiancée's father cleared his throat uncomfortably, the sound rough in the crystalline silence. The mother shook her head slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. I could see them processing what they'd just heard, reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the man sitting at the head of their daughter's table. "Pride killed your love?" I continued, my voice steady as stone. "And now look at you. You try to push away your own father on Christmas, as if I'm dirt under your shoe. But the truth is, you're the one dragging yourself lower with every lie." The chandelier light seemed harsher now, casting sharp shadows across faces twisted with discomfort and judgment. Even the Christmas music playing softly in the background felt wrong, too cheerful for the destruction happening at this table. My son tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. I looked at my son and saw layers of pretense peeling away like old paint. Underneath all the expensive clothes and practiced charm, the boy I'd raised was still there. The child who used to clutch my hand on the first day of school, who'd cried when his shoes split open on the playground because we couldn't afford new ones. That boy had been sweet and honest, full of dreams, but not ashamed of where he came from. He'd hug me tight after every bedtime story, told me I was the best dad in the world when I helped him with homework at our wobbly kitchen table. But somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared, buried under ambition and shame and the desperate need to be someone else, someone better, someone worthy of sitting at tables like this one. I wasn't speaking to that lost boy anymore, though. I was speaking to the man who'd betrayed everything good about his childhood, who decided that loving me was too expensive if it cost him the respect of people like these. The man who'd just tried to throw away his father like garbage had to hear what that choice really meant. My decision came as sharp and clear as my words had been. I would leave this place, but not quietly. Not like the embarrassment he wanted me to be. I stood slowly, deliberately, letting the movement build tension in the room. The scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor rang out like a gunshot in the silence. Every eye followed me upward, watching as I straightened to my full height. My son's eyes were wide now, panicked, like he was finally understanding that this wasn't going to end the way he'd planned. His perfectly arranged dinner was becoming something else entirely, a public trial where he was both defendant and witness. "I raised you with nothing but love," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Worked double shifts so you could have new school clothes. Went hungry so you could eat seconds. Drove a car held together with duct tape so I could save money for your college fund." His fiancée's parents exchanged a look that spoke volumes. The mother's expression had shifted from shock to something softer. Maybe pity, maybe understanding. The father nodded slowly, his businessman's mind clearly calculating the cost of the sacrifices I was describing. "And today," I continued, "you cast me out for nothing but pride." My son's lips moved soundlessly, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, might find some small piece of the boy who used to love me without conditions. Instead, he just sat there, frozen by his own shame. I turned toward the doorway, but paused before taking that final step. There was one more truth that needed to be planted before I left. One more seed that would grow in the silence after I was gone. "I came here hoping to belong," I said, my voice softer now, but somehow more devastating. "But maybe the truth is, I already do. Just not in your world, son." The words hung in the air like a benediction, and a curse rolled into one. His fiancée's parents looked at each other again, and I could see the judgment forming in their eyes. Not judgment of me, judgment of him. Here was a man who'd thrown away his father's love for the chance to impress people who barely knew him. A man so ashamed of his roots that he'd tried to cut them off completely, not understanding that roots are what keep a tree from falling over in strong wind. My son's lips moved like he was trying to form words, but nothing came out. The silence stretched between us, thick with 27 years of love and sacrifice and disappointment. I nodded once, a goodbye that felt as final as closing a coffin lid. Then I walked toward the door, each step taking me further from the son I'd raised and closer to the man I was about to become. A man who didn't need anyone's permission to exist. The outside air hit my face like ice water, sharp and clean and honest. After the suffocating politeness of that dining room, the December cold felt like freedom. My breath came out in white puffs that disappeared into the darkness, carrying away the last traces of that house's expensive perfume. My tears started before I reached my car, hot against my frozen cheeks, then turning cold in the winter air. But these weren't just tears of sadness or humiliation. Mixed in with the pain was something I hadn't felt in years, relief. I had lost my seat at his table, yes, but in standing up from that chair, I'd found something more valuable. I'd found my dignity again, dusty and dented from years of being ignored, but still solid underneath. My hands shook as I unlocked my car, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline of finally telling the truth after years of swallowing it. The engine coughed to life, and I sat there for a moment, letting the heater warm my face while I processed what had just happened. I'd walked into that house as a man begging for scraps of love from his own son. I was driving away as someone who remembered what it felt like to respect himself. And somehow, despite everything, that felt like winning. Word spreads fast in circles where everyone knows everyone else's business. His fiancée's parents had friends, and those friends had friends, and suddenly the story of Christmas dinner was making its way through country clubs and charity events like wildfire. The version they told wasn't kind to my son. They spoke about the elderly father who'd worked himself to the bone raising his child alone, only to be cast aside when he became inconvenient. They talked about the shocking revelation that the sweet young woman hadn't left for money at all. She'd left because she couldn't stand watching the man she loved destroy himself with shame. My son's carefully painted image began peeling away like wallpaper in a flood. The smooth-talking charmer who'd won them over with stories of his bright future was revealed as someone willing to throw away his own father for social approval. His phone calls went unanswered. Invitations that would have come automatically before started going to other people. At the country club, conversations quieted when he walked by, then resumed in urgent whispers after he passed. The truth I'd spoken at that dinner table had become a shadow that followed him everywhere, and there was no way to make it disappear. Soon, even the people he'd wanted most to impress would turn their backs on him entirely. Within a month, my son's professional life began to crumble like old concrete. Business colleagues who'd once praised his charm and ambition now looked at him differently across conference tables. The story of Christmas dinner had reached his office, twisted and retold until it became legend. Partners who'd trusted him with important clients started having second thoughts. If he could discard his own father so callously, what did that say about his character? What did it mean for their business relationships? Lunch invitations dried up. After-work drinks happened without him. The networking events where he'd once shined became minefields of whispered conversations and sideways glances. His boss, a family man who'd lost his own father the year before, couldn't look at him the same way. During performance reviews, questions about character and values kept coming up, delivered with disappointed looks that cut deeper than any criticism of his work. The reputation he'd spent years building was collapsing one conversation at a time. And the worst part, from his perspective, was that he couldn't fight back against the truth. His pride had promised him status and respect. Instead, it was delivering him isolation and professional death, one burned bridge at a time. I stayed away from his house after that night, but through friends and neighbors, I heard how things changed there. The dinner parties he'd loved hosting became smaller, then stopped altogether. His fiancée's parents found reasons to visit other relatives during holidays. At the dining room table where he'd tried to erase me, an empty chair sat where I used to sit. His guests would ask about it. "Where's your father?" And his answers grew shorter and angrier each time. First, he tried lying. "He's not feeling well." Then deflecting, "We had a family disagreement." Finally, he'd just changed the subject entirely, his jaw tight with anger at having to explain my absence. But the empty chair spoke louder than any explanation he could give. It reminded everyone who saw it that he was the kind of man who'd thrown away his father for the chance to impress strangers. The silence where my laughter used to be became a constant accusation. The missing place setting was evidence of his character on display every single meal. That empty space haunted him more than my presence ever had, because it told a story he couldn't rewrite or control. At work, the whispers followed him down hallways like ghosts. Colleagues who'd once respected him now spoke in hushed tones when he passed, sharing details of the Christmas dinner story that had spread through their professional circle like a virus. Some pitied him, the poor man who'd made such a terrible mistake. Others mocked him openly once he was out of earshot, joking about daddy issues and family values. The worst were the ones who simply avoided him, treating him like a social disease they didn't want to catch. His paranoia grew with each sideways glance, each conversation that stopped when he entered a room. He started snapping at innocent jokes, reading insults into harmless comments, building walls around himself that only made the isolation worse. During team meetings, his suggestions were met with polite nods instead of enthusiastic agreement. His ideas, once valued, now seemed tainted by questions about his judgment and character. The pride that had demanded I be hidden away was now eating him alive from the inside, turning every interaction into a potential threat, every relationship into something that could crumble if people learned too much about who he really was. But they already knew, and there was nowhere left to hide. His fiancée never came back. I heard through mutual friends that she'd moved to another city, taken a job offer she'd been considering before their relationship fell apart. She'd been right about him all along. She was tired. Tired of loving someone who was ashamed of everything real in his life. She'd tried for months to make him understand that love meant accepting all of someone, not just the polished parts they showed in public. But he'd been too scared of losing the respect of people who barely knew him to listen to the woman who knew him best. Now he was alone in the house we'd helped him buy, surrounded by expensive furniture and perfect decorations that felt hollow without someone to share them with. The life he'd built to impress others had become a beautiful prison with only himself for company. He called her sometimes, I heard, left voicemails that started apologetic and ended angry, demanding explanations for abandoning him when he needed her most. She never called back. Every empty weekend, every silent evening, every holiday spent alone reminded him of what he'd sacrificed for the approval of strangers. And slowly, he began to understand that pride had cost him everything he'd actually valued. But understanding and fixing were two different things entirely. That Christmas night, I cooked myself a simple dinner in my small apartment. Just chicken soup and cornbread, nothing fancy, but it tasted better than any meal I'd eaten in years. For the first time since my wife died, I felt genuine peace sitting at my own table. My dining room was tiny compared to his. My dishes were mismatched secondhand finds, and my Christmas decorations came from the dollar store. But everything was honest. Nothing was pretending to be more than it was. I thought about the boy he'd been, how he used to help me make Christmas cookies even though we could only afford the cheapest ingredients. How he'd been proud of our little apartment, how he'd bragged to his friends about his dad who worked so hard to take care of him. That boy would have been horrified to see what he'd become. But maybe, buried under all that shame and ambition, that boy was still in there somewhere, waiting for a chance to breathe again. Dignity sat beside me at my small table like an old friend I'd forgotten I missed. And for the first time in years, I realized that dignity tastes sweeter than any dessert money can buy. Sometimes, lying awake in my single bed, I remembered the child he used to be. The little boy who'd run into my arms after school, chattering about his day while I made dinner on our hot plate, who'd fallen asleep in my lap during late-night movies, trusting me completely to keep him safe. I wondered where that boy had gone, at what point love had become conditional. When belonging to a family had started requiring an entrance fee he decided I couldn't pay. But then I'd remember his face at that dinner table, the moment when all his masks fell away and I could see the confusion and pain underneath. That boy was still inside my son, I realized. He was just smothered under layers of shame and fear, suffocating under the weight of trying to be someone else. The real tragedy wasn't that I'd lost him. It was watching him lose himself, piece by piece, until he couldn't remember who he'd been before he started running from his own history. Pride had been feeding on him for years, and it was still hungry. Still eating away at everything genuine and good, leaving behind only the shell of a man desperate for approval from people who didn't really know him. And I wasn't sure there would be anything left to save by the time it finished. 6 months after Christmas, word reached me through a neighbor who knew someone at his office. He'd broken down during a meeting, she said. A client had made an offhand comment about family values, and something inside him had snapped like a rubber band pulled too tight. He'd started shouting about respect, about being misunderstood, about people judging him for choices they couldn't comprehend. His voice had gotten louder and angrier until security was called, until he was escorted from the building while his colleagues watched in stunned silence. The carefully controlled facade he'd maintained for months had crumbled in a single moment of raw emotion. All the pain he'd been swallowing, all the guilt he'd been denying, all the loneliness he'd been hiding, it all came pouring out in one spectacular public breakdown. He was put on administrative leave pending a wellness evaluation. His clients were quietly transferred to other advisors. His office was cleared out while he sat at home, finally forced to face the silence he'd created around himself. The truth I'd whispered once at a Christmas dinner had grown into an avalanche that buried everything he'd thought he wanted. Pride had eaten through his career, his relationships, his peace of mind, leaving him with nothing but regret and the echo of words he couldn't take back. The phone call came on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks later. I almost didn't answer when I saw his name on the caller ID, the first time he tried to reach me since Christmas. His voice, when I finally picked up, was barely recognizable. Dad? The word came out broken, like he'd forgotten how to say it properly. Can we talk? It wasn't an apology, not yet. It was something smaller and more desperate. The sound of a man who'd finally hit bottom and was looking up for the first time in months. The confidence that had carried him through life was gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable I hadn't heard since he was a child. Please, he added when I didn't answer right away. I know I don't deserve it, but I don't know who else to call. There was something different in his voice, something that made me think of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. The pride that had built walls between us was fractured now, and through the cracks, something softer was trying to emerge. For the first time in months, he sounded human again. Broken, desperate, lost, but human. And I had to decide whether to let him find his way back home, or let pride finish what it had started. I haven't decided yet whether I'll open that door when he comes knocking. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. The boy I raised is still in there somewhere, but the man who cast me out is still there too, and I'm not sure which one I'd be welcoming back. But one thing is crystal clear now. That Christmas night changed both our lives forever. I lost a seat at his table, yes, but he lost the foundation everything in his life was built on. When you throw away the people who love you unconditionally, you discover that conditional love isn't really love at all. Sometimes revenge isn't a carefully planned plot with elaborate schemes and dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's simply the truth spoken out loud at exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right people. Sometimes it's letting someone's own choices destroy them while you watch from a safe distance. Pride promised him everything he thought he wanted: status, respect, acceptance from people who mattered. Instead, it delivered isolation, professional ruin, and the kind of loneliness that eats you alive from the inside out. My son told me to leave before dessert that night, suggesting no one there needed to associate with someone like me. But in the end, I left him with a lesson far heavier and more bitter than any sweet could ever be. And that lesson will keep eating at him, long after the dishes are cleared and the table is empty. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.